Hello, and welcome to another homeschool edition of More or Less on the BBC World Service. This week, the UK went into the kind of virus-induced lockdown that many other countries have already experienced, or, quite likely, will experience soon. Loyal listener Henry has emailed moreorless@bbc.co.uk to say,
I would love to hear from one of my heroes, David Spiegelhalter, on the topic of risk in the context of COVID. I think there is much to reassure us and common sense to impart.
Henry, your wish is our command. I spoke to David Spiegelhalter, the chair of the Winton Centre for Evidence and Risk Communication at Cambridge University, on Monday. He's been taking a close look at the data being used by the Imperial College London team who've been modelling the disease and advising the government. The numbers show that the proportion of people who get infected, who go on to die, increases with age. And David noticed that the trend matches almost exactly how our background mortality risk increases sharply with age. He plotted both lines on a graph and could scarcely believe what he saw.
I was amazed. They go right along the same curve.
So what I understand you're saying is that if you contract coronavirus, you've got the same risk of dying over the next couple of weeks as you would normally have of dying over the next year, no matter what your age is.
Yes, very roughly. And also, actually, not only just your age, but also your background health, because most of the deaths each year in normal life are from people who are already chronically ill. And similarly for coronavirus, that we hear that the people who die often almost always have some accompanying health problems. And on the whole, though, the risks for very healthy people are a lot lower. And so I think it's quite remarkable. Yes, if you get the virus, it's like in the next couple of weeks, you're going to cram in a year's worth of background risk.
And this really struck me thinking about the societal impact, because for an individual, that doesn't sound too bad. And I think for a lot of people, it isn't too bad. If you're 95, you obviously recognise you might not live another year. If you're 35, you probably will live another year unless you're very unlucky. But from a social point of view, if one just imagines everybody in the country getting this disease at the same time, then you have the whole year's worth of deaths suddenly happening over the next couple of weeks. And just imagining what that would do to the hospitals, what that would do to the cemeteries, would be absolutely horrific.
And that's exactly what the Imperial Group found in their analysis. They said that if the virus was just allowed to let rip, we did absolutely nothing. Then around 80% of people would get it and about 500,000 would die. And that means essentially if everyone got it, around 600,000 would die, which is a year's worth of deaths. So we would get, if everyone got the virus, we'd get a year's worth of deaths all at once, boom, like that. And so, even anywhere near that is just going to be absurd in terms of the stresses on society. So that's why, damping this down, suppressing it becomes absolutely vital, because although the risks for an individual are low, when you multiply them up over vast numbers of people, then the total impact on society becomes huge.
One thing that seems to be going around is, well, it's like the flu. I mean, just looking at flu and flu deaths, is it like the flu?
Well, no, it's about twice as infectious as the flu and about roughly 10 times as dangerous, perhaps. And in particular, many people get very nasty respiratory conditions, which even if they survive could lead to long-term harm. So it's a nasty disease it can cause in some people, a small minority of people. One thing that people do forget, perhaps, which I think it is worth remembering, is that flu is, again, small risks for individual multiplied up over the country, it means it can be very nasty. So a good year of flu, around about 700 people might die in this country. Bad year, 13,000, 15,000 might die. Median, around about 6,000 to 8,000 people are dying a year of flu. So that's a lot. In fact, this year it's been a very good year for flu, very low level. We're currently running below average winter mortality in this country. There's only been 100 deaths in ICUs from flu since last October. I should say only. Of course, this is terribly, these are, serious affairs, very tragic, but it's actually much better than normal. So what this means is that the country can cope with and seems to be able to deal with 6,000 to 8,000 deaths a year of mainly elderly, vulnerable people from seasonal flu. And we may, if we're very lucky and everyone suppresses this and keeps to the rules, keep COVID mortality down to that kind of level, or maybe a bit more than that. But that's what it's hoping, that it might be, less than 20,000 or so.
And if we do, it's worth saying, that's not because COVID's no worse than flu. That's because we've gone to the most extraordinary measures to put the economy in a coma in order to make it 20,000 rather than 200,000 or 500,000.
Yeah, absolutely. But it might mean then that if these activities are successful, even if we do get up to the level of hundreds of deaths a day, which we will, it might mean that overall, over the whole winter, our actual number of deaths might not be that much bigger than normal. It's quite a difficult, concept to talk about, I think, is that because the people who will succumb to COVID-19 are elderly and have other conditions, many of them are likely to have died fairly soon either, and the disease is bringing their deaths forward, and maybe by not a huge amount. So that means that overall, the deaths that are being allocated to COVID actually would normally have been allocated to another cause, a few months later on.
So are you saying that if everyone in the population got this disease, basically what we'd be doing is just bringing forward all the deaths we could expect over the next year, and it would just happen all at once? But overall, the death rate over the course of a year wouldn't really change?
Nope. No, that's the let's say if everyone got the virus all at once, you'd have 600,000 deaths, whatever. That would be an estimate, and that's how many die in a year. Now, it's not just the people who are going to die in the following year, and all the survivors then are just are bound to live for the following year. A lot of people will still die as well. There's a lot of new deaths from the COVID, of course. The degree of overlap is a matter of argument. In other words, how many people would have died anyway in the next year of the people who are now dying for COVID? And I'm not going to make a guess of what that is. But even if it were, let's say 50%, you'd still have 300,000 excess deaths in the year, and that is a massive, massive issue. Anyway, we just can't cope with that sort of event. It would just be too catastrophic for words. So, that's why things have got to be done.
I do still occasionally encounter people who say, I'm not scared of this virus. I'm not going to be beaten by the virus. I'm not afraid. I'm going to still go and see my friends. I'm going to hang out because, you can't let this thing get us down. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't meet people like that, and I'm glad I don't, because I would get cross with them, because it's not an individual decision. This is not an individual about my risk is low. My risk is quite low, I think, but still, the point is not my risk to me, it's my risk to the people around me. With infectious diseases, it's the community, it's the society, we're absolutely vital, and we all owe a duty to that. We do not want to export our maybe what be slightly low risk to other people who might have higher risk. And we know about how quickly people can infect others. If I've got the disease and I'm wandering around, I will on average infect like 2.5 people. And then each of those would infect 2.5 people, which would be an additional, 7 or so people. And each of those, there'll be an additional 15 or, I can't do the sum, 17 people. Anyway, it increases exponentially. And exponential increase is frightening because it just, hammers up the whole time. Our deaths so far in this disease have been increasing about 30% per day. Now, those figures are really frightening because although we're doing deaths still in the tens, I did a rough calculation and it would lead to sort of 10,000 deaths a day by mid-April.
That is all we have time for this week, but something tells me this won't be the last we hear of this pesky virus. Please keep your questions and your comments coming in, whether they're about COVID-19 or about anything else. We're at More or Less at bbc.co.uk. We will be back next week, and until then, goodbye. More or Less was produced this week by Ruth Alexander and Kate Lamble. The programme was mixed by Nigel Appleton, the editor was Richard Varden, and I'm Tim Harford. Tim Harford.